Yeah, we'd pretty much get in a habit of where we sit. I think it's because on Tuesday nights, they literally put our names and tell us where to sit. Go ahead and call this meeting Assembly Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee to order. This is a special meeting, notice from 10 to 11:20 this morning, and we'll start with introductions.
Mark Littlefield.
Karen Bronga.
Anna Brawley.
Zach Johnson.
Meg Zalatel on the phone. Mr. Martinez.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Mr. Solt.
Randy Schultz here. Thanks.
Right. Mr. Rivera.
Present.
All right. And I know we'll be joined by Mr. Constant here in just a little bit. So we have two items of business today. The independent cost estimators estimate for Terminal 2 construction, Cargo Terminal 2, and the final report on the economic study done for the Port of Alaska. Prior to that, though, I've asked Deputy Municipal Manager and the Port Director just to give us a really brief update on our summer construction. As you may have seen in the paper, there was a delay. So I'm going to turn it over to them for just a brief moment, and then we'll turn to the items of business.
Thank you, Colby Hickle, Deputy Municipal Manager. So I'm happy to report that we have turned in all of the comments back to MARAD, over 4,000 pages. They've accepted them. We expect to have some sort of decision. We're hopeful next week. We're hoping to get our EA and our FONSI back. I can't promise that we'll be doing any digging or any construction next week, but the odds are in our favor. And I would really like to thank the Assembly and MARAD and, of course, the administration for working collaboratively to get this process going forward, because it really was a team effort. And just working together really showed MARAD that we were serious about the grant. We were serious about keeping this project on track. And I think that was really important for them to see. So thank you.
Any questions? Okay, great. Thank you for the update. Really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for the independent cost estimators estimate for Terminal 2, Cargo Terminal 2 construction.
Okay, good morning. Thank you. My name is Eric Adams, the Jacobs Program Manager for the PAMP program. And today I'm going to speak about the T2 independent cost estimate for the next terminal. I will caveat the total T2 ICE report is about 462 pages. And so what we've done is summarized it here for you guys and walk through the steps of what that looks like and the impacts on the decisions on how wide T2 is. So with that, next slide, please. So as the MOA contracted with Kelly McNett Consulting to provide the ICE services, we looked at three alternatives. Basically the base case, which is 69 foot wide, 938 feet long, wharf with no ship to shore container crane provisions. And that's key because coming up, I'm going to talk about what those container crane provisions are. Alternate 1, 69 foot, 938 foot wide wharf with waterside crane rail provisions only. That's basically putting a crane rail just on the water side. And then alternate 2, a full width, 120 foot by 938 with full STS container crane provisions. Just want to remind everybody, due to the stage that we're in, it's class 3 estimate with an accuracy range of -15 to +20%. Next slide, please. So the disciplines of work that went into the ICE estimate is basically ground improvements, slope renovations, armor rock protection, maintenance dredging, existing dock removal, civil site work, electrical, new wharf construction, and dock utilities. Next slide, please. T2 base assumptions, just to be clear on that. It's scope, no cost for STS crane provisions, and the schedule, the independent ICE estimator, 2 years of construction on the base. Next one, the scope, 69 foot by 938. This includes the waterside crane rail, piling, crane rail, and $500,000 for additional electrical components. And I'll show those in photos, what they are coming up. And then the ICE estimated at 2 years of construction. And the key here is still the 69 foot width. Next slide, please. And here's the T2 alternate 2 assumptions. This is 120 foot wide, basically mirroring what T1 is. This includes additional costs for the wider wharf and full STS crane provisions. And STS stands for ship-to-shore cranes. Provisions include waterside crane rail, $1 million for additional electrical requirements, and a landside crane rail as well. So the ICE estimated this at 2 years of construction. They put out very high risk on it and say a potential third year of wharf construction into 2031 will likely be needed based on their experience from T1. And that actually plays into the other two PDFs, the schedules that I show you. If the assembly in the future decides to go with 120-foot wide, it shifts the entire program 1 year for like the NES2 demolition and the PT. And that's basically what the 11 by 17 handouts are on your guys' desk. Next slide, please. So here's the numbers straight out of the report. You can see the KMC symbol down there on the bottom. We just pulled it straight out. There's a base bid is $401 million. Alternate one is $422 million. Alternate two is $478 million. And that is the 120-foot wide by 938 wharf, STS crane provisions, and all those items included.
Let's just do clarifying questions as we go through the slides, and then we'll go into kind of more substantive questions around the various alternatives. But Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thanks. I just had a question. It was on the prior slide, but we can stay here. You said that alternative two basically would take an extra year to construct or an extra season.
Yep.
And is that also true with alternate one or just alternate two?
Alternate one at 6-9 foot wide, it would not take an extra season.
Okay, thank you. That was all.
Mr. Johnson?
Yeah. And then I know we're not there yet, but the back slide sums us all up in costs, and you guys can look at that, and those will be the key ones.
Mr. Littlefield?
So looking at the first page, the estimates can vary from -15 to +20.
Yes.
So we'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
Yes.
You might have to create ranges for us and do the math.
Yeah. Okay. Next slide, please. And so the T2 options just kind of run through, make sure everybody's clear. The top three are the three alternates that we looked at. And the bottom two bullets there are basically if you guys ask us to go back in the future and expand these items. Methods and costs to retrofit a future waterside container crane rail, which I would highly recommend against, but that's your guys' decision. Method and cost to expand with a future landside container crane rail. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here is the baseline photo, 6-9 foot wide, no crane rail on the waterfront. Key things here I want to point out is the pile spacing on the front is 40 feet on center, and the width is 69 feet. So this is basically what T2 looks like right now if you guys told us to advance with no changes. This is what T2 would look like. Any questions on this one? Okay. Next slide, please. This is just a cross section of what it would look like. Baseline 6-9 feet, no crane rail. Front row piling space at 40 feet on center. The cost of this is $401 million per the ICE. And the midpoint of construction, what the $401 million is based on is December 2029. And once again, this is a class 3 estimate, -15 to +20%. Next slide, please. Okay, now I want to talk about what is required if you add STS crane provisions. So additional piling under crane rails, additional power to supply cranes and in-deck cable trench, and additional hardware for crane stops and stowage.
Can you maybe ground us a little bit in what our current Cargo Terminal 1 cost estimate is, right? Because what we're doing is that's just a point of comparison.
Yeah, okay. Through the chair, thank you for the question. So you guys approved $643 million for the T1, and we had a number of different estimates on this. If you guys remember, I walked the body through. The difference on the ICE is about $204 million, and I pointed out the reasons why those differences were on that. And so I can send you guys back that PowerPoint slide, or I can pull it up on my computer and walk through again if needed. But I will indicate that the ICE was considerably lower than the Jacobs estimate and the designer record estimate as well. Yep. Next slide, please. So as we talk about what are the requirements for adding the ship-to-shore cranes, just want to point out that there's large pieces of equipment to support these cranes. Each crane weighs about 1,400 tons. And so we have to have crane tie downs connected to large link plates anchored into the wharf in the wharf socket. Design loads range from 200,000 to 1 million pounds. And the reason why I'm pointing these out now is because if you think about, you ask if the decision is to go back and put them in later, it really destroys the dock. I mean, these are big pieces that we have to put back in, and you're seeing coming down further down, other presentation slides on why it'd be such an impact. We have to do it later. Crane storage.
You already have a clarifying question, Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned additional pilings, and maybe I'll get to this later. So is that in addition to what is currently put forward as the design?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And I'll show that through the chair, Assembly Person Brawley. You'll see I mentioned 40 feet on center. You put in these cranes, the crane rails need to be on 20 foot on center for the piling.
Hey, Eric, before you go, we looked at this yesterday and I said, boy, I wish we got a picture of a person standing next to that crane. So you can get an appreciation for the size of these things. But if you look at that arrow that's all the way to the left and pointed up, an average person's height is a little bit taller than that.
Yeah.
So you can appreciate how big these things are going to be when they're sitting on the dock.
Yeah. Thanks. And just to add, the current cranes that are down there are 39 feet wide. The new ones will be 100 feet wide. So then the photo on the right is the rail-in-rail trench is basically what the cranes roll up and down on. And those will need to be installed as well. So next slide, please. Crane power. This will need to be installed. If you look at the far left photo, the first arrow on the left is a rail power cable trench without the cover. That's basically so the electrical power that's powering the cranes can roll up and down the dock. It gets wheeled up onto the crane like a big giant wheel. And then as they move, it gets rolled out. The one on the right there is basically the rail trench where the cranes will ride up and down on. Doesn't have the railroad ties on it yet, but that's what it looks like before you place them in. So I mentioned the power, which is important going forward, is the far right. We'd have to put power vaults in for future expansion. If you wanted in the future to go back and add crane to T2, these would need to be installed. And to just give you guys an idea, all this would have to be demolished off of the T2 if you did not install this now. And there's a cost associated with that, and you'll see those going forward. Cut more slides on STS crane provisions. Crane stops. These are basically at the end of the dock. So if a crane blows down, these will prevent the crane from rolling off the dock and falling over. These need to be bolted in. Design loads range from 300,000 to 1 million pounds per rail. Next slide, please. And just here's some more photos of what the crane storage. When the crane isn't being used, they tie down into these big iPads into the dock. And these stowage pins as well drop down. And so these additional items that we'd have to add if you go with STS provisions. Any questions on the photos? Okay. Next slide. And I think this gets to Assembly Brawley members' question. Baseline at 6'9" foot wide plus waterside crane rail. The big difference here is the pile spacing 20 feet on center, right? And then with this, we'd recommend adding a couple of those additional STS requirements, some of those photos that I showed with you, if we decide to go with this.
Does our current permitting for the project encompass all of these options?
Yes, Assembly Chairman. Yes, they do. If you remember one of the previous presentations I gave the body here is we permitted for worst case scenario. And so if you decided 120 feet, we're covered. If you decide for 69, we can shrink. I mean, we tried to take every option you guys could think of, made sure we're covered and not to put you guys in a box. So, yep. So key, this is a 20 feet on center, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. So install waterside crane rail now, front row piling spaced at 20 feet. Install cast in place cable trench, as I mentioned, one of those items that we'd want to install. Crane rail and cable trench, you can see by the red arrow there, this is where it would be installed at on the front row of the pilings. Cost estimate is about 422 million if we do that now from the ice, with a range of -15 plus 20%. Okay, next slide, please. So this is T2 at 120 foot wide. The changes here would be the front row, you'd have 20 feet on center piling as well. And also the back row would be 20 feet on center as well. And that's for the crane rails. The width of the wharf here is 120 feet. And so if the assembly decided to go with T2 with full STS options, this is what it would look like from a top view. So.
No, you're fine. So when we're talking about work on alternate one for with the 69-foot wide and including some of the supporting infrastructure for the cranes, just to be clear, the crane would not actually be able to utilize that, right? We're just sort of future proofing it, but the crane wouldn't be able to go on to T2 until such time as it was expanded to the 120-foot width. Am I understanding that correctly?
Through the chair, Assembly Person Johnson, you're correct. The crane's 100 feet wide right now. The T1 is 120 feet wide. The cranes on T1 are 100 feet wide. T2, as the assembly, the AO that was passed last year, I can't remember the exact number, is 69 foot wide. And so the crane, without it being expanded to 120, with the crane provisions, cannot go on to T2.
All right, so alternate one, we'd be paying for future proofing it, but we wouldn't actually capture any value in the immediate term with that.
No. Okay, next slide, please. And so this is T2 at 120 foot width, crane rails, just the red arrows, the crane rail and cable trench installed, and the back row as well, the crane rail installed. So install cast in place cable trench, crane rails. The cost is about 479 million per the ice. Midpoint of construction is December 2029. So the front bullets came from the independent cost estimate. We added the potential additional year of construction because that's what the ice said it would be a likely high risk. And so with that, the total cost would be about 516 million right now for this. And these are based off the ice numbers. Just want to add the ice was considerably lower than previously.
Bro.
So just making sure I understand. So basically comparing the other two, 401 million is the base case, alternative one is 422, alternative two is 479. But then what you're saying with the 516 million is the additional cost for that extra season and all the other costs, is that right? In addition to the structure?
Correct, because you have the mob and demob for the contractor that can't be here during the winter. You have the overhead costs for the contractor, the marine mammal, QC, miscellaneous survey, 6 million. We did an escalation adjustment of 3%. That'd be about 8 million. And then that pushes a midpoint of construction with that additional year that we base numbers out to June of 2030.
Okay, thanks. So just to be clear, we should be talking about the 516 million, even though the 479 is the structure, just because it has to be done that
Yes.
way. Okay, thanks.
Yes, great question. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we put a couple slides together here. This is the future build out scenarios of what that would look like if you kept it at the current 69 foot wide today with none of these provisions. What we try to do is give you an outlook of what the impacts would be in the future. Next slide, please. So what you have here is a baseline at 69 foot wide, future waterside crane rail. Basically everything here in the pink would need to be demolished section, retrofitted with piles 20 feet on center, add the crane rail, add the cable trench. I will point out that this would pretty much render the T2 dock where no user would be able to use it for about 2 years going through this construction process. And so this would be an impact to anybody wanting to use the T2 dock. Next slide, please. And so what would that look like? We would pretty much have to demolish an entire front row of piling there, remove the fenders, remove and replace the fenders. It would require shutting down the terminal to construct. Wouldn't be usable. just doing this cost here would add about $144 million in today's dollars. And what we did on the last slide is we extrapolated that out 20 years for everybody. And so everything in the pink there would have to be demolished and replaced, and it'd take about 2 years to do. Okay, next slide, please. So then this is if the assembly makes a decision that we install the waterside crane rail now. In the future, we go back and install the landside crane rail. And so what that would look like is we'd start with a new section, adding 20 piles on center. This is the pink here. We'd have partial trestle demolition. Next slide, please. Then we'd move to the middle section there. You'd have demolition and partial demolition of the middle trestle, and then you'd be able to expand back there, basically the pink area, add the new section. Next slide, please. And then add the new pink section there where you'd have partial trestle demolition as well. So next slide, we'll talk about the impacts. So this is a cross section. Basically, if you look down the entire 938 feet, the pink is what would be added. New section added with piles 20 feet on center. Install the landside crane rail in the future. Requires partial demolition of row C pile cap for connection. Requires partial demolition of trestles 1 through 3 during the season, which would impact the user. Requires temporary successful closures of obviously trestles 1 through 3. The cost is $174 million. On the end slide, we do push that out 20 years based on 3% escalation a year, so you can see what that looks like. But the future build-out scenarios that I pointed out here, these would be disruptive significantly to any user on that dock. So next slide, please. Okay, here's the summary. So the baseline at 69 feet, no crane rail is estimated by the ICE at $401 million. Baseline at 69 foot plus the waterside crane rail is $422 million. T2 at 120 feet with crane rails from the ICE is $479 million. And then as Assembly Person Brawley pointed out, the number you should be looking at is the $516 million there, because most likely it would require an additional year of construction. Future build-out scenarios that I pointed out is a baseline at 69 foot, no crane rails. Today is 401. If you add the waterside rail in 20 years at an escalation of 3%, that's $260 million. And if you add the landside rail as well, that's 314, which brings you to a total of about 975 million, which is not exactly double, but the cost greatly increases. And then you'd have partial loss of revenue, which isn't calculated in here for the users on T2. Then item number 2 is baseline at 69 foot plus waterside crane rail. If you just wanted to install those items now, 422 million. And then in the future, add landside, we took the 174 million, escalate out 20 years, 314, you have 736 million.
All right, there's some questions here. I have one. Why is there not an option? I guess the future build out scenarios, is there never one with T2 and then an additional add-on? All right, T2 at 120 feet with additional work to be done to kind of do the possibility of the full realization?
No, because at that time you're looking at, if you go back a couple slides, let me find it here. So if you have 120 feet with no crane rail provisions, let me see what slide it is. This, keep going back, it's this slide here. Right, so if you picture this slide here, this is the waterside crane rail. You have to demolish as part of the dock. And then if it's 120 feet wide, you'd have to demolish that, basically that last part as well. And at that time, you're rebuilding the dock.
Got it. Okay, thank you for the clarification. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm trying to digest these. I took some notes. So I guess maybe I'll share back what I think I heard and then see if this is accurate. I'm just trying to assess here. So it looks like obviously we could save some money now by building kind of the minimum, the base case that would not allow for at this point any kind of crane or container activity there for the time being. We could do that and put in crane rails, but then not be able to use them without having to retrofit later. That's alternative one. And then alternative two would be the full kind of basically a mirror of terminal one, so that both of those things could be used by those users. And then the build out, it looks like either retrofitting the base case, the most affordable one, or build out to the finishing out alternative one. So I guess really what it seems like what it comes down to is, well, one, how much we want to spend upfront, and then two, whether we think that there is any scenario in which in the next maybe 20 years, say, that we would want to use Terminal 2 for container ships, because either we put the cranes in now or the ability to do that, or whatever else we build, we would have to go back and retrofit if we don't do that up front. So does that seem accurate?
Through the chair, Assemblyperson Brawley, yes, that's accurate.
And can I just make a couple of points of clarification? When you say container ships, Toad actually sells a container ship and brings it here, twice a week. Configuration is roll on, roll off. But when we're talking about container ships down the road, it's being able to use T2 for container ships that require ship-to-shore cranes. So that would give us the ability to unload one vessel at either terminal with ship-to-shore cranes, or we add more ship-to-shore cranes to be able to unload two container ships that are ship-to-shore cranes, but still have the flexibility for Tote's current business model to be serviced there.
Great.
So it's a flexibility thing. And what we do with T2, the challenge, and I think what we've been talking about from the beginning, from a logistics standpoint, is 69 feet gives you so much capability for what kind of utility you'll get out of both terminals. At 120 feet, you increase by orders of magnitude the flexibility that you have for both terminals.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just observe, then if whatever we do this time, it looks like that alternative two is about 20% more expensive, more or less, or a little bit more. And that, so then I'll just say it's also really important for us to then think about this in context of the economic study. And then I'm good for now. Thanks.
Yep, that's next. So I want to kind of run through a couple of, I guess, procedural pieces to this. So one, thank you for the timeline. This is really good. It's really good to see where projects overlap. I see the note at the bottom that it doesn't include design, permitting, and procurement activities. It'd be really great if it could, especially since you're talking to folks who have to be involved in that procurement process and kind of know when our decision points are.
And we struggled with whether or not to put that on there, because the font would get smaller and the page would have to get wider if you wanted to be able to read it. So all of that information is available. If you'd like us to go back and populate it with all of that,
or maybe
buy good glasses.
Well, yes, actually, I'm taking mine off to read the small stuff these days. Or maybe even just a drop-down box that rate T1 procurement and contracting is estimated to occur in August, September, October 2024. And similarly, kind of when your drop dead date would have to be for T2 to stay on the schedule. That's all I'm trying to get at. So have these options gone through the PAMP Design Advisory Board?
Not at this time. There, all the DAB members are aware of it, and you want to answer that?
Well, I can say that we talk to each other pretty consistently off the record on this, and I think that you'll find that both Mattson and Tote and the port, we're pretty like-minded on what we think the best way ahead will be. But we haven't, we've sort of been waiting for what the right time is to formally pick a winner, if you will.
Great.
On which of these works.
So I think you need to send it through the Design Advisory Board. I would like to see them issue a resolution and the rationale. They're the experts. You all are working together to bring it back to us. And I don't know, the other question that comes from that is when's our drop dead date? When we need to provide you some guidance on T2.
Assembly Chair, I would recommend to the port and the administration that we meet next month at the DAB, walk through these items, vote on it, move forward. And the goal would be to start the design of this by the end of the year, put it out for bid and procurement. And last time we spoke, you mentioned that you wanted 2 public process hearings on this. And so sometime by the end of the year.
Okay, great. That's helpful. Mr. Solt?
Thank you. I don't know if I missed it, but just wanted to get feedback on what is, I guess, the standard for shipping. Is it roll on, roll off? Is it ship to shore? What do most ports do, and what do you think the future is headed more towards?
And I'll go ahead and I'll take that question. The industry standard is ship-to-shore cranes for container deliveries. We have a very efficient roll-on, roll-off capability that TOTE provides here. And, part of our responsibility is to make sure that as we design and replace this facility for the future, that for as long as TOTE is a tenant here and uses that business model, that we do nothing that adversely affects their ability to use that business model. But with an eye to the future, when it comes to containers, the industry standard is ship-to-shore cranes. And if you take a look at a picture of any port around the world, or as you go down the lower 48 and you drive an interstate up and down the east or west coast where you can see a port, you see those big cranes out there. That's how the majority of the world unloads container ships when they come to ports.
Any follow-up? Yeah, go ahead.
So, given that information, the marine, the vessels that TOTE uses, are they used elsewhere, or are we dependent on those particular vessels? Thank you.
Can you
I don't think I understand
state
the
that
question.
one more time, Mr. Sold? It kind of garbled.
There we go. So I was just asking, with roll on, roll off and the TOTE vessels, are we tied to those particular ships, or are they using roll on, roll off elsewhere around the world? So just looking to the future, if something were to happen to these particular ships, are we then relying on reinvestment in a similar type of marine vessel?
So, Mr. Solt, I think that question's probably best set for TOTE. We do have someone here from TOTE, or they can follow up offline.
Yeah. Mhm.
We have Art Donlin from TOTE.
Yeah. Yeah. But I will say, there's nothing we intend to do in this design that prohibits, the current TOTE ships from coming to this port for as long as they would like to continue to bring them here. And if they replace those with more modern versions that do the exact same thing, the facility will support that as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And I think it'll be key if this goes to the Design Advisory Board and we bring it back to this committee, that we'll need TOTE, Mattson, and the folks from the Design Advisory Board here at the table with us so we can have that conversation. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm thinking back to the last time we all sat down and we were looking at the cost estimates for T1, and depending on whether you're looking at DOR or ICE estimates, there was a pretty significant delta, I think well over $100 million in the possible range. And as I recall, when we kind of asked, like, well, which do we think is more right? It's like, well, we don't know until we put it out to bid and we get the contract back, and then that'll give us better information regarding what the actual cost for T1 is. Yeah. And we committed to a design for T1. So as I recall, we expect to get those bids back this fall, correct?
Through the chair, Assemblyperson Johnson, most likely August timeframe.
Okay.
So end of July, 1st of August.
And since a lot of that difference depended on what type of construction method we'd use, et cetera, I would imagine those methods would also be pretty similar for T2, whichever design we go with. So I'm guessing, hoping here that, by the time we get into the fall and we get closer to really having to make firm decisions when it comes to T2, we'll have, I would hope, more refined cost estimates. I understand, there'll still be some variability, but we'll have a better sense of what it'll actually be. I mean, right now we're looking at the -15 +20 range. Do we think by the time we actually kind of get to the end of the year that we'll actually be able to narrow that down and have a more accurate estimate?
Through the chair, Assemblyperson Johnson, we will look at once the bids come in, we'll be able to extrapolate those numbers onto T2. But once again, we will complete a final design of record estimate, and we'll be able to compare that against the T1 bids that come in.
Okay, thank you.
All right. And so here's what I understand is about to happen with regard to T2. It's going to go over to the Port Modernization Program Design Advisory Board, hopefully in June. And then we can schedule time for the July Enterprise and Utilities Oversight Committee meeting to have a conversation or a work session, however timing works out. I want to give it at least an hour. And hopefully emanating from that, we can prepare a resolution or work with the administration to prepare a resolution that then gives the guidance that you all are looking for the design on T2. Does that sound workable? The other piece I think that's missing from this conversation, of course, is the financing for Terminal 2. We've been hyper-focused on Terminal 1 and getting that financing in place, the revenue bonds, the TIFIA loan, securing state and federal grants. It would really just be good as we have that conversation in July to start to get an idea of that landscape. What is that financial landscape looking like? And what is our ability to go after that funding fairly early in this process? We do know there's a lot of federal dollars still around, and just so we can kind of understand that better, because we are still looking at another significant investment, well over, $400 million.
Yeah, so I took those notes, and we will work with the CFO's office on the second piece of this. I'll talk to the DAB members, and we'll put something on the calendar. And I'm assuming that the way the DAB is designed in code is going to be what it is for a little bit longer.
For a little bit longer,
Yeah.
yes.
And at some point, this may be out of my hands or whoever comes after me's hands to see to closure, but we'll get it started.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. And one question I have about the financing for the CFO and you all to explore is, if we get a TIFIA loan specific to T1, does that preclude that finance option moving forward? I don't know about the idea of getting that finance mechanism serially.
To the chair, you see Alden shaking his head. The TIFIA loan is for both. I'll let them speak, but my understanding is both T1 and T2.
This is what happens when you try to hide in the back.
I could never hide from you, Meg. The application is for basically both docks and whatever else we can lump in. Hopefully NES1, once we get an EA next week, will be lumped into that. There's a couple of things that won't be allowed, but we're looking at originally about $1.1 billion is that total cost, and then we get like a third of that. So our TIFIA loan is looking to be in the $400 million range is what we're doing, but is definitely both docks in that estimate of allocation.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so I think as we look at the plan of finance is do that math for us, right? Assuming that we're successful on some things, and then we kind of know where our delta is. All right. Any other questions on Terminal 2? This has been really helpful. Thank you. Very well laid out options.
Just one last thing through the chair. We picked 20 years to extend that out from that 174 million, but whatever number you guys would like to see, we can add that too. But we just picked the 20 years to extrapolate out to show the delta difference. So
yeah.
And don't forget, we're hoping this summer we'll get some kind of confirmation on our settlement lawsuit, and that's 360 million as well. So that I'm in advance of hopefully decisions in the fall and financing. I'm hoping that there'll at least be a decision one way or the other on that. But just also remember the TIFIA loan thing is like end of 2025 before we would get that confirmed, but we're certainly working through that process.
Thank you. Ms. Branca?
I was going to ask this question sooner, but so the piles are 40 foot on center now, and would you only have to change them to 20 foot on center on that outward edge of the dock, or is the whole thing need change of spacing?
Through the chair, Assemblyperson Bronga, let me just flip to the side, the correct slide here and show you. So it's basically 4 bays of piling, what I'd like to call. It's a T2 at 120 foot wide with crane rails at the top of that one there. So if you go the full STS, there's 4 rows of piling going lengthwise like this. So you'd have to put the front row, the water side, 20 feet on center. The 2 middle rows would stay on 40 feet on center. And then the back row itself right here would have to go 20 feet on center. And that's just to support the crane legs, right? Because that's where the cranes roll up and down. So the 2 middle rows there would still be on 40 feet. The farthest water side and farthest land side would be 20 feet on center.
Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thanks. So we currently have occasional cruise ships come in, right? And they just tie up to the cargo docks. Is that how they've been operating?
That's right.
And
Always will.
Always will. But I'm guessing they're probably completely agnostic as to what the width of the wharf is for their purposes or any other design considerations.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thanks.
Yeah, we can pull it off with 69 feet because we have for a decade now. We would love to have more space. I think they would too, because the security aspects that come with what you got to do around a cruise ship will limit the amount of maneuverability you have on the dock at 69 feet. So we get a little bit more of that, but we're not hanging our hat on that as a future business growth item. It is what it is. And we managed to make it work, and we'll continue to manage to make it work regardless of how wide the dock is going to be.
Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to share a little bit of math that I just did, and I want to correct. I said that the alternative 2 would be about 20% more than just the base case, but it would actually be about 28%. So just wanted to clarify since I said it wrong. It's closer to 30%. But then also just something to think about, and hopefully that the design advisory board folks will think about it, and members as well. When I'm looking at this, it seems like the 2 decisions are basically whatever we want to build. Do we want to build all of it now? And then there's the options within that. And then with these retrofits, basically we should be comparing those retrofit ideas with alternative 2, because it's basically turning those other scenarios into that alternative 2, the full build out, but later down the road. So just to say, I did the math on if you were to retrofit the base case to, which basically becomes that full 120 foot, that alternative 2, the total cost would be about 88% more than if we did it up front. But again, that would be maybe 20 years from now. So you're basically paying for it down the line. And then if you were to retrofit the alternative 1, the 69 feet that has some of the rails, so you're not having to put all of them in, then it's about 40% more compared to doing alternative 2. I was doing a factor compared to that comparing the 516 million to the total cost of those build outs.
Yeah, I'd have to take your math right now. I didn't
Yeah.
put that on the slide, so I'll trust you, math. Sorry, through the chair, Assembly Person Brawley. The key here, though, is if I want to kind of drive home here, is if the Design Advisory Board and the Assembly doesn't move forward with the current waterside crane rails, you're going to have significant loss of revenue. That T2 dock is pretty much going to be out of commission while we install all those items. And whoever's using that T2 dock would have to move to T1 or something else would have to occur.
Thank you. I guess we're going to that's a great segue into idea of revenues and economic impacts of the port. So let's go ahead and turn to our next item, which is the final report on the economic study done for the Port of Alaska. And we have a guest with us today. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and you can run through your presentation.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is Dan Solomon. I'm a senior economist with Moffitt & Nichol, and I'm also the lead of the economic assessment study that we just recently completed. And I'm here to give you a summary of that. Next slide, please. The outcome of the analysis is simple and one that sounds familiar, and that is Alaska relies on this port. And in the context of PAMP is the opportunity to prepare both the port and implicitly the state as a whole for the future. The analysis establishes that there's a very real need for 2 container berths in Southeast Alaska. And when we say 2, we mean 2 facilities that offer similar, if not identical, service capabilities. This holds true even in the outlook for flat to stable volume growth, and it certainly holds true as we are considering a project with a 75-year planning horizon, where the only certainty is that conditions will change. The analysis also establishes that the Port of Alaska is the best location in the state to build and operate these container terminals. This conclusion is reached by our independent research and also confirmed by the users and tenants of the port, which have stated there is no economically viable alternative to the Port of Alaska when considering the volume of cargo handled, the infrastructure that's required to do so, and the connectivity to the inland markets that it supports. The analysis also concludes that the cost of this disruption of service is significant, and we'll get into the figures in a bit. But when considering the alternative routings which would be required to replicate the service offering, the values are really quite substantial. Next slide, please. So in terms of the infrastructure options that are under consideration for PAMP, we're focused on this inflection point, a decision which will come in about 20-year period. So your 20-year extrapolation on inflation is extremely relevant. And that is what is the utility of T2 under the 69-foot wide option and what a 120-foot option provides. It's this juncture is when the tote vessels reach the extent of their life and will have to be replaced. Should tote rebuild or deploy the same vessels with the 69-foot option with the ramps, this terminal maintains its utility. However, should tote change the vessel type and or be replaced by another carrier, the 69-foot wide option drastically loses its utility and was necessitate that a wider berth be developed, and that's in order to accommodate, traditional cellular container vessels or Conroe container vessels, which are a combination of lift-on, lift-off, and roll-on, roll-off vessels, which would likely replace the tote vessels in the future. Next slide. To help you visualize what this could look like, consider option one, which is the development of a wider T1 and a narrower T2. Nothing changes. This is the status quo. This allows for the same operations we see today with the cellular Matson vessel on T1 and the ro-ro tote vessels on T2. Under the uniform berth option, option two, the flexibility of the docks increased significantly. The same utility is maintained, which allows for the existing services, Matson on T1, tote on T2, to operate simultaneously. But it also allows for the same simultaneous operations of mixed vessel types, including Conroe vessels, which utilize the traditional ship-to-shore cranes on the front, so that ship denoted on the right and in this under option two, the second one down on the right. So container stacks in the front, ship-to-shore cranes operate with a row ramp on the back. Leading on to the terminal. And I think the question was asked offline by someone on the phone, in terms of alternate vessel types that we see inside the market, these are quite commonplace. The tote vessels that are currently operating are unique to this trade route. There's two terminals that handle it, Anchorage and Tacoma. There are other ports throughout the world where you see these Conroe vessels, and these are quickly becoming the normal, a happy intermediary between traditional cellular container vessels and a ro-ro option as well. And that's clearly extremely valuable here in Alaska. Similarly, if you go with the wider T2 option two, you can accommodate two traditional cellular vessels, container vessels simultaneously. So what you see Matson currently operating with, you could also replicate that service on T2. And we've also presented, what's the case if a larger ship shows up? Larger container ships are trending larger. We're not saying you're going to see a 8,000, 10,000 TU vessel call the Port of Alaska. That's not realistic. But there are small gains, and we know Matson is introducing larger ships. But similarly, that impact is maintained if a large cruise vessel shows up and extends over the length of, say, T1. this would allow you to accommodate a smaller container vessel, smaller whatever, military ship that should show up and require the ship to shore cranes. So it's adding a lot of flexibility to the operations where you don't have that option, where you don't have that same flexibility under the option one, the narrow T1, wider T1, narrow T2. And what this flexibility does, it is, next slide, sorry. It also inherently provides redundancy, meaning that should something happen that disrupts operations at one of the terminals, there's capacity and functionality at the second terminal to take over the operations. You know, here in Anchorage, the discussion, the typical event is a seismic event that we talk about and what the implications are on the port. And while that is certainly the benchmark event that has to be considered and planned for, the truth is there's a wide universe of occurrences that could bring port operations to a stop. And these can be small, and these could be catastrophic, but the reality is they happen worldwide and they happen more frequently than we think. So providing redundancy won't prevent these occurrences from happening, but it will help you recover from the event that they do. Now the fun piece. Next slide, please. So as part of our scope, we were asked to determine what's the economic value of the infrastructure at Port of Alaska, and in particular, you know, for the container and general cargo docks. So in order to do so, we made the simple assumption that the container handling operations are shut down for a week, whether that's from a seismic event, equipment failure, you know, multiple bird nestings, what have you. It assumes that the container volumes are forced to find alternate routes. So these routes include barging containers up through an alternate gateway in Alaska. In this case, we modeled through Seward. And that Seward was just chosen as an option through our conversations with port users that have flagged that as a potential alternative, or your trucking volumes up from Tacoma by the Alaskan Highway. So we've presented a range of estimates that reflect, you know, the degree to which the cargo is either trucked or barged. And, you know, again, we recognize there's limitations to this analysis. There are endless variations of assumptions as you can go into and model. But for simplicity's sake, we've chosen a very defined scenario. And that scenario is we assume 4,000 TEU are displaced from the Port of Alaska and must find an alternate route into the market. And 4,000 TEU is about the volume the port handles on a weekly basis, give or take. Our base case assumes 50% of the cargo is handled through Seward, and 50% of the volume is handled via the Alaskan Railroad and trucked up. And that 50-50 split is not haphazard. It includes the assumptions around the handling capability of Seward, the time required to handle the volume of barges that are needed to carry the level of cargo that's entering the market.
So like we did before, if you have clarifying questions, let's ask them and then ask broader questions at the end. When you say economic costs associated with a 1 week Port of Alaska shutdown, you mean the entire thing shut down, right?
Sorry. Yes, is it through the chair? Through the chair. Yeah, the base assumption here is that you've lost both use of both T1 and T2 to handle containers.
Thank you.
So,
Right, so let me make sure I understand this. Your calculations are on if we lose both container operations on both terminals that don't exist right now. We only have one container terminal, right? Or are you calling you're calling the RoRo as well?
Yes.
Okay.
So the whether it's container, whether it's RoRo, this is a displacement of 4,000 TEU worth of cargo.
Yeah.
Ms. Brawley.
And in our context, RoRo is containers.
It's
here.
been used a
It's
few
not
different
just
ways.
vehicles.
Yeah, it's been used a few different ways in this conversation.
So treat the two as container ships, which they really are.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. So generally speaking, as I understand, like pound for pound, it's cheaper to ship something on a ship than by road. Is that right? I mean, that's really what this seems to be saying.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. And so really you're just saying that maybe 50% of things could be trucked up, and then the other 50% would still need to be shipped.
Well, actually, our default preference would be to put the cargo on barges. It's cheaper and the infrastructure at Seward can accommodate a certain volume. What we've assumed though, and reflected in the scenario and taken into consideration is that, Seward can only handle so much. So we basically assumed you have Alaska Marine Lines barges, which handle, upwards of 700 plus TEU per barge, but it takes time to get those up here. It takes time to work them at Seward, and just, based on operational challenges, at max, you could put maybe 6 or 7 barges through there a week, fully loaded. The remainder of that cargo then is going to come up by by road.
And just briefly, could you explain what the environmental sustainability costs and then macroeconomic, because what I'm also seeing is those basically scale up the more you have trucks on the road.
Yeah. So basically, we've incorporated the DOT guidelines for benefit cost analysis in terms of safety costs related to various modes of transportation. So that's what's reflected on a per mile basis here. Similarly, on the environmental and sustainability costs, there are measures of emissions and sound pollution, things like that get incorporated. The macroeconomic impact is, to represent the total, or not to represent, but an attempt to reflect what the total impact is on the macro economy of Alaska as a result of these increased transportation costs. So what we've used is the Bureau of Economic Analysis's RIMS multipliers for water transportation, which clearly sort of for $1 in, there's a $0.9 impact to the macro economy. And that's what's represented in that gray bar. So yeah, I think, when we've discussed this slide internally, there has been, obviously, there's room for argument. And the intent of the slide is, the intent of the analysis is to establish the order of magnitude of a service disruption at the port. Whether that's the full loss of, full 4,000 TU that are displaced, 2,000, 1,000, you can do the math and figure out essentially how it scales. But, again, depending on the need, or the availability of barge versus truck traffic, there's a significant impact to the economy overall as a result of a service disruption. Any questions? I think this might be a good place to pause.
Yeah, since you paused, I do have a question. I mean, so things that could take the port offline for a week could also take off the ability to truck from Seward or truck in. So, I mean, the way I'm thinking about this is that really, for me, the base case is a range, which is about $40 million to $70 million for a 1 week port shutdown. And then our ability as a municipality to likely recover that depends on the circumstances, whether it's just a port related failure, sorry, port, or we have a natural disaster of some sort and we can invoke government help, being the larger government, the big G government. So, okay, thanks. Any other questions on the economic analysis? Okay, we'll just move on then. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think to that point as well, that, this is really focused on freight and the implications on that containerized cargo. But one of the questions that has come up historically as well, what does this mean in terms of the military's ability? And that's somewhat outside of our scope to answer and our ability, but it sits out there in the realm of possibilities.
Yeah. Anecdotally, it's been interesting. We participate in a lot of state-run disaster response recovery exercises. And more often than not, the way they start them off is for there to be, either total loss of the port or partial loss of the port. And before you're into those exercises for about an hour, everybody throws their hands up saying well, we can't break the port that much. We have to do something else in order to get some value out of the exercise and let everybody participate. So that's how important this facility is to the state with respect to disaster response and recovery, and why we're investing what we're investing to make it as resilient as we can. And the other piece of that is to make it as redundant internally as we can, because the state can't afford more than one, given the size of the population. This is the one they got. It's in all your eggs in one basket, whether you like it or not, kind of scenario.
Ms. Bronga?
I was just nodding and pretending I understood this chart. But 100% Seward, 75% Seward, 25. I'm not really sure what that's about.
Sure.
Thank you.
Through the chair, Assembly Person Bronga. Essentially, if 4,000 TEU could be handled through the Port of Seward over the course of a week, the cost to the overall economy would be $8.8 million. If they can handle 75% of the cargo, but 25% has to go by road, that cost increase jumps to $23 million. Yep.
Thanks.
Sure.
Great. Let's keep going. We have about 20 minutes left for this meeting, and I know there's probably going to be a little bit more discussion. Do you have more slides?
I do. And, I think, sure, let's go through them. Next slide. There's somewhat supportive in the sense that I wanted to present. You'll see this in the report, obviously, but, a clear point of conversation is the need for redundancy inside the port. So we've conducted a benchmarking exercise where we looked at ports operating in similar economic conditions, namely islands here. So in the US, we looked at Port of San Juan, Port of Guam, and Port of Hawaii, just to give you a sense of the scale of what the infrastructure is they have in place, and the redundancy they have in place as well in terms of multiple berths that are able to accommodate containerized and general cargo. I think, there's recent natural disasters, if you will, that underscore the importance of having redundancy inside a port, both in Hurricane Maria in San Juan recently, and then the earthquake in Guam, which really put a big dent in their port operations, but having the redundancy allowed them to recover quite quickly. Next, and I apologize for the wordiness of the slide. We've also talked about the ability for the port and its strength in reaching the inland markets and why that's important. From a connectivity perspective, Port of Alaska clearly stands out as a leader in its ability to reach clearly the Anchorage market, but also inland to Fairbanks, the core population centers of southeast or south central and central interior Alaska. Obviously key markets. This isn't to discount what the other ports are capable of doing, but they're smaller. They serve more localized economies. And in the case of the southeast area of the state, Juneau, Ketchikan, these are really independently up. They cannot connect to the broader economy and the population centers that we need. Next slide. Part of our scope of work was to engage port users and tenants and have conversations with them about, the utility of the port, the benefit of it to their operations, the challenges it has for their operations, what have you. But three sort of key messages were shared uniformly between them. Overall, in various words, they underscored the importance of the Port of Alaska to the overall economy cannot be understated, or sorry, overstated. There's clearly a sense and an understanding that this gateway is crucial to meeting the economic needs of the state, and in as such, it should be, provided and adapted to allow for efficient transfer of cargo, whether that's containers, liquid petroleum, whether you're talking to the military, whom have you. That's obviously a shared message. They also mentioned across both, certainly on the liquid petroleum, liquid bulk users and the container carriers themselves, the need for redundancy, the need for at least 2 berths inside the terminal is underscored both for container operations and for the liquid bulk operations. And they also reiterated again in various words that there's no economically viable alternative for the Port of Alaska over a long term. There's the ability for Seward or Whittier to absorb some of the activity over a short period of time, but for the underlying value of their businesses, the Port of Alaska is what provides the efficiency in their supply chains to allow them to operate properly. Next slide. And just getting into the outlook, we provide just an overview of the types of vessels, the frequencies they call. The truth is, and we highlighted on the next slide, we're not expecting, and we wouldn't tell this committee that there's a likelihood of strong growth of volume or activity through the port itself. In terms of the number of ships calling, the types of vessels that are calling, those will change. Those will absolutely change. But in terms of the volume moving through, we see very stable underlying support for the container growth on the next slide. And on the liquid petroleum volumes, there's been a recent surge, obviously, related to the parcel, the heightened parcel activity that we experienced over the pandemic. I think the underlying factor that contributed to that, and which is essentially the shift to e-commerce, is well supported and will continue to drive higher volume, higher demand for jet fuel, higher level of parcel activity through the airport, and consequently, higher petroleum volume through the port.
Yeah, the petroleum part of the business is interesting to watch. When I started at the port, we saw 4 tankers a year. And as the slide says, we're up to about 37 now, which is where the source of supply evolution has happened in Alaska. It's been pretty amazing. So we have to pay attention to the petroleum infrastructure just as well as we have to for the cargo infrastructure, because 2 berths is a necessity for sure.
Okay, so I think that's the last slide other than your lovely thank you slide. So we're going to jump into it here kind of on the broad basis. I have Mr. Constant, then Ms. Brawley.
So I have a series of questions. Do you recall how much we funded this analysis for?
I believe it's 245,000.
Okay, thank you. And I believe a substantial portion of that funds was an appropriation to study the economic growth of the port. So this is no stroke against the contractor. We had a pretty lively conversation when I was in DC. And I just want the members to understand, this is a classic example of how an executive in the municipality can take an appropriation that was intended to provide a certain set of information for us, the growth model, and then not answer that question really, just a little slide at the end without any data or basis, just a slide, but instead answer the question that they want to tell you. And so this is a sales job, and it's a sales job by the port to get their double dock face full port now. And for my part, that may be the final answer. I've witnessed the users be kind of browbeaten into accepting the position that the port director wants. If you ever get a chance, there's a movie you should watch. It's called Thank You for Smoking. And it will give you great insight into how this kind of thing happens, where you get a great report that lays out a case for why you have to do what they want, but doesn't actually answer what you asked for. So that's my commentary on this report. It's good analysis. I thank you for it. You answered the question you were asked, but it wasn't the question that we funded.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Brawley?
Thanks. I had a couple, well, I guess 3 different questions about the assumptions. One, looking at this volume outlook, what general assumptions did you make about population growth in Anchorage and Alaska?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. To the extent of looking at future growth through the port, I mean, there's a whole section of our report dedicated to the volume outlook. So I encourage Mr. Constant to have a look through that. You know, the volume outlook, the fact of the matter is the economy here is in deep trouble. It's flat, and there's very little population growth. There's very little manufacturing growth. There's there's some service opportunities that are going to support income growth, but in all respects, the Alaskan economy is going to need to rely on exogenous forces to help it grow. And to the extent that a port is a physical gateway to allowing that to happen, and it creates efficiency in an economy. And if you block that, you basically put yourself at a disadvantage. So the quick answer is, we have flat to negative outlook for the container volume growth. We have positive outlook for liquid bulk petroleum growth. We have stable outlook for dry bulk related, particularly for construction and break bulk commodities, things like that. But, overall, we're building for a base, and the base is expected to stay flat.
Thanks. And my other question, well, 2 other, I'll just say both of them now, but they're separate. Can you talk about the assumption about the basically increased line of that petroleum products? And I say that because, I've looked at a lot of, for example, transportation assumptions that do this, right? And I know that, we can't see into the future 50 years from now, but I'm always skeptical of that kind of straight growth out. So if you could talk about that. And then the other question is, you talked about other ports. I'm just imagining hypothetically, for example, if Dutch Harbor, if something happens out there, that's the other really big container port that doesn't really interact with us right now at all. Was that also part of your modeling, kind of hypotheticals like that?
So to answer your second question first, no, the Dutch Harbor volume and the activity out there are excluded from this analysis, particularly on the cost side. So that was strictly reflective of the level of activity that's going through the Port of Alaska. So whether Dutch Harbor and Matson has volume that's destined to or from that facility, that was ignored for the purpose of this study. And yeah, agreed. It's a classic looking consultant volume forecast chart. You get a curve and it just grows indefinitely. The alternative is to just flatline that out. I think, there's a very good and credible argument that the shift to e-commerce is, it's tough to argue against that. And the level of parcel activity that's coming from North Asia and requires fuel here at the airport is, the view is that this should continue. We're about halfway up that curve into the e-commerce sort of saturation of overall consumer sales. And, going forward the next 10 years, it's probably going to double. So to the extent that Port of Alaska and the airport participate in that, you see there's a lot of support underneath that.
So pretty much all the petroleum then would be aviation fuel or the growth in versus, cars, which are moving to electric in theory. And,
yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Brawley. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you. So going back to the economic cost analysis, obviously if 100% of the cargo goes through Seward, that's a much better, outcome. And you said that's assuming that all of the goods are moved via marine barges. And I think you were saying that would be about 6 or 7 loads coming through Seward a week. Did you guys look at sort of what the operating capacity is of the marine barges? And did you talk to the Port of Seward about just, hey, hypothetically, worst case scenario, would you be able to accommodate 6 or 7 barges a week? I mean, what's kind of the basis for that?
Okay, so yeah, the capacity of the barges we took essentially from Alaska Marine Line fleet. So they have, they operate 700 to 800 TEU barges here on the trade lane, and then slightly larger ones out to Hawaii. We didn't make any assumption about the availability of fleet. We just assumed, the barges are available and they could accommodate, upwards of, as many full barges as the volume would demand. The handling and essentially the handling capacity of Seward is dictated by what we estimated to be the moves per hour that it would take to turn a full barge, unload it and load it back up. So, based on the activity, they're working at almost a full day in order to do that, which would limit a single berth facility to 6 or 7 barges a week, and that's how we came to that number. But we did not reach out to Port of Seward to ask.
Okay, thank you. And then second question, we're talking in this model here about completely losing any capacity at the port. And maybe this is in your full report, but I'm curious, did you look at what happens if we lose one terminal? I mean, like right now, today, if we lost one of the terminals, one of our operators would be able to continue going, the other one basically would not. So, I would think basically you could say it's about half of the volume would come through, but maybe they pick up some slack. And then also kind of with that, where I'm going is, let's imagine if we're contemplating future scenarios, if we look at the base design where we have 2 terminals that essentially mirror the infrastructure we have today, that would seem like be relevant for that framework. Whereas if we build full redundancy and we lose one of those terminals, and the other one, I would think, would still hypothetically be able to accommodate both operators. I mean, does that get us to basically zero impact? I mean, I can't imagine it's actually zero, but do you guys kind of model some of that out?
We do as a firm. That's an engineering simulation question. So for first part, you could use the tool. Essentially, say you lost half the volume. Seward would be your low-cost alternative, assuming you can't fit it in at T1 or T2 inside Port of Alaska. So the $8 million that we had for a full Seward activity, you could scale that down to 4. That's the math would work out that way. We're sending, as opposed to 2,000, or as opposed to 4,000 TEU through Seward, we're sending 2,000. I think so. The short answer is you could, on a single berth facility, you could certainly handle both container operators over a short period of time. The challenge you run into is, the reliability of those berthing windows is very narrow, and you begin to run into queuing model constraints, which is essentially, if somebody's out of turn, that backs the other one up. That's adds cost, that adds service disruption. If you have a cruise ship that wants to come, they can no longer come. The military would be, competing for space. You could certainly operate over a short term on a single berth, but it would be very detrimental over a long period of time.
Yeah, and then it becomes a management situation. Nobody should expect commerce to carry on as usual in a disaster response and recovery scenario. But things like, cruise ships would, if there was even one on a schedule, the smart decision would be we've got to make room for commercial traffic. We just had a disaster. What's your interest in coming to Anchorage? We can make those kinds of decisions to put the focus on sustaining commerce as best we can in a contingency situation. That's what we do. So I'm not too worried about competition for berths, other than We have two carriers that like to come on the same day, same 2 days, twice a week. And that will change for some period of time, but that is a manageable change until we can get things back to normal.
Okay, I'm going to be mindful of time. We're right at, so we have two more people in the queue. I am one and Mr. Constant is the other. So I think my question is, I see that chart on the second to last slide. There is a report somewhere, because my question was, did we review the economic potential of the port, not just the impacts due to the port being unavailable? I got the clarity of what happens when the port's unavailable, right? Our worst case scenario. But I guess what I'm still trying to grab is, what is the economic potential? So you show that there's this opportunity for cargo to go up and petroleum to go up. Are there dollar figures assigned to that? Because I don't know, and I'm not an economist, how to extrapolate that into dollars. Because what, as a policymaker, I'm being asked is it worth the investment difference between the 69-foot berth and up to a $500 million Terminal 2? And so what, over the life of that dock, could the economic potential be? And were you able to like grab a number or a range for us? And I know it takes some assumptions. Everything's based on assumptions. I get that.
Well, no, the answer is no, not on the liquid petroleum berth and not on, the berth as a whole. Our focus was on the general cargo container terminal operations. So if you flip the costs on its head, that becomes the economic opportunity.
So 40 to $70 million, the same as the loss per week? That doesn't make sense to me.
No. If the upside were equivalent to the loss, you could make that. But we're basically forecasting flat volume growth. So on the liquid petroleum berth, I mean, we could put a number to you, give you a number that would, allow you to say from an economic impact what the value of that higher petroleum volume is to the state.
So on this chart,
Yes.
it goes up.
Yes.
And we have the line of where we're at today. It
Yes.
suggests we exceed that line in future out years. Is there a dollar amount associated with exceeding that line?
Yeah.
That would.
Yeah, we can make it. We haven't done it. What's pushing that line up is the liquid petroleum volumes, and our
Okay.
analysis was focused on the containers.
Okay.
But it's easy enough.
I look at the whole port as an
Yeah.
entire ecosystem.
Sure.
So I think that that's important analysis to have. Mr.
Thank you. On your page 4, slide 4, the one with the pictures of the ships, when you have all 8 of those ships under your uniform berth, that isn't implying that those 4 that are stacked in the column 1 are for T1 and the 4 in column 2 are T2, right? It's any one of those 8 ships could use either terminal.
That's correct. Yeah, with the exception of the tote vessel top right, because they would rely on the ramps and trestles.
So you're not actually building a uniform berth. You're building a berth that supports both sides being used for the lift on, lift off, but only one side that's being used for the roll on, roll off. Is that the proposal then?
Well, I think
Maybe that's not a study question, maybe, but this picture here is, and I'm trying to understand this picture. If it says 8 lift on, lift off, or 7 lift on, lift off ships could use T1 and T2, and the roll on shift can only use T2, then if that's the case, it is not in fact a uniform berth or a uniform terminal. It's just a uniform berth, meaning it's really great for one operator.
Through the chair, Assembly Member Constant. So this is what T2 full width would look like. You have the 3 crane, not crane, but the roll on, roll off for the current user. Tote would be able to use T2. T1 does not have the middle ramp there. It only has 2 trestles, where T2 would have 3 trestles.
So then this gets to a fundamental financial question. Why in the hell would the roll-on, roll-off provider be forced to pay for the additional costs that they have no value from, and the other side gets their competitor to pay for their infrastructure upgrades so they can use both terminals. This is fundamentally unfair. And I understand the port has argued historically, it's not about who's operating, it's about the port's needs. But it's how is this getting paid for is always the question. And if you, the concept of the uniform berth to me was it would be mirrored, that you could have both operators using both terminals. But if in fact we're now at the point where one operator is going to be asked to pay for the infrastructure increases to provide for sustainability that they're not even going to be able to use effectively, it's to me getting back to a fundamental inequity in the model.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you for the picture.
Mr. Constant. So yeah, I guess the question for redundancy or other is there anything that would make T1 roll on, roll off capable, right? So, right, we talk about this idea that T2 is redundant to T1, right, and creates that opportunity. Is there anything that you could do to make T1 redundant to T2, right, if you're looking at it as a full ecosystem? And I would like you to take that question up at the Design Advisory Board, and you all can advise us.
No, it's a fair one. The good news is we haven't turned a spoon of dirt on any of this yet. So there's time to cost that out and look at it practically. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. So with that, we are going to move on. So we're already over. Audience participation. Anyone? Anyone at all? Seeing and hearing no one, we're going to move on. Do members have any additional requests or questions for the port to take back on this topic? For purposes of, follow-up, knowing that we'll be taking this back up in earnest in July. Yes, Ms. Brawley.
I think just in general, I think we have a lot of good questions for the DAB to talk about, but I think the question is really, do we invest in this up front, or do we hedge our bets a little bit more, and then with the idea that it will cost more later, but we will buy, up to 20 years of time. That's really kind of one of the big things in my mind. And I think that's something for the users to think about, because they're much obviously closer to operations and what the industry and what their projections are. Thanks.
Okay. Noted. All right. Anyone else? Anyone on the phone? With that, we are adjourned. Thanks.
Be back in 15 minutes.